When I was a sophomore in college at Virginia, I had a huge crisis in confidence. My sophomore year of college, I started to feel like I couldn't shoot it, I couldn't handle it, I couldn't guard anybody. And, you know, when I was in high school, I was the player of the year in the state of Texas as a senior, and I had a lot of options as to where to go to college. I had a lot of scholarship offers on the table. And my first year at Virginia, we were loaded, first of all. I had really good teammates when I was at Virginia, really good players. And so my first year at Virginia, I didn't start, but I was the sixth man. I was first person off the bench. I didn't start the game, but I almost always finished the game. And I probably averaged 20, 25 minutes a game. Got to play a lot on a team that went to the Final Four. My second year, when I came back, we had everybody back, and then some. We were even better my second year than we were my first year. And I started out the season with the exact same role. I was still the sixth man. I was still getting 20, 25 minutes a game. I was still finishing games. But at some point in that season, things started to go south for me. Again, I started to feel like I couldn't shoot it, and that was one of my strengths. I mean, one of the reasons I got to play at a place like Virginia at my size is because I could shoot it pretty good and I could handle the ball pretty good, better than most people. But all of a sudden, I didn't have any confidence in those things. I felt like people were just going to rip me every time I tried to go by them. It felt like the more I practiced my shooting, the worse it got. Basketball started to not be fun. Like, I would dread going to practice. I even dreaded the games after a point because I didn't like the way I felt when I was playing. I felt like I was just going to mess up. I felt like I wasn't going to hit my shots. And again, it seemed like the harder I worked, the worse it was getting. And I started at some point in the season, as I began to lose confidence in myself and as my play suffered, my coach started to lose confidence in me. And then what started happening is my playing time started to go down. And that brought on a whole new level of stress and worry and me sort of beating myself up and not feeling confident and not feeling like I could play anymore because my minutes were, it seemed like every game I played less and less. And I'd never had to deal with that before. I'd played the whole game all through high school and played a lot my first year at Virginia, so all of a sudden my minutes were starting to go down. So it was one of probably the worst season of my basketball career because I just didn't like the way I felt when I played. You know, the one thing that kind of kept me going that season is my team was doing very well. We spent most of that season, Coach Calder probably remembers this because he was at Carolina when I was at Virginia. We spent most of that year ranked number 1 or number 2 in the country. And so my team was doing really well. So the one thing that kind of kept me going, even though personally I was miserable, the one thing that kept me going is we had a chance to win the national championship. After the ACC tournament, we made the NCAA tournament. We were a number 1 seed. We kind of breezed through the first few rounds of the NCAA tournament. And again, every game I'm playing less and less. Like, I'm not even looking forward to the games. And it was like, I hate sitting on the bench. I always hated sitting on the bench. But during that sophomore year, like, there were a lot of moments where I didn't even really want to go in the game. And we made it to the Final Four. And the Final Four that year was in New Orleans. And I'm from Houston. So it was only about 4 or 5 hours from my house. So we went to the Final Four. And in the first round, we played UConn. That was UConn's first year of making the Final Four. That was Lobo's freshman year. And we beat UConn in the semifinals. And we made it to the national championship game. And Pat Summitt and the storied Tennessee team, and I can remember sitting on the bench before that game started, or right when the game first got going, and thinking, you know, this is it. Like, this is the national championship game. This is what I've been working for and sacrificing for and dreaming about since I was a kid, and certainly since I had been at Virginia. And I can remember sort of sitting there taking all that in, but yet feeling kind of like, this is it? Like, it just didn't feel as good as I expected it to feel because of what I was going through with my confidence, because I just wasn't enjoying the game and I didn't even want to go out there. I was afraid to go into the game because this was like the biggest stage of all. And to make it even worse is we lost that game in overtime. We had it won basically in regulation, and we made a few mistakes at the end of regulation and they tied it up, and we lost the game in overtime. So we didn't win the game, but I got close enough to it that I could tell that even if we had won the national championship, it wasn't going to change the way I was feeling. It wasn't going to change the way I felt about basketball, the way I felt about myself. Because I was thinking, if that was it, if that was the national championship, that's what I've been sacrificing for and going through all this misery for, if that was it, I'm not sure I want to keep playing basketball, because I'm not even sure that's worth it. It's certainly not worth the bad feelings and the misery that I had been going through that whole season. So I knew something had to change, or else I wasn't going to play the next season. I didn't want to play the next season. And while I was on that plane ride, I remembered something that my coaches had told me when they were recruiting me. When my coaches were recruiting me to come to Virginia, one of the things they were really proud of was that there was a sports psychologist who worked for UVA. He was on the faculty at UVA by the name of Dr. Bob Rotella. And I don't know if he's even still there, Monica, but at the time there was a professor of sports psychology named Bob Rotella. So I decided on the plane ride, okay, when we get back to Charlottesville, I'm going to call up Dr. Bob and see if he'll talk to me, see if he can help me, see if he can fix my confidence problem. And so he sat in a chair and I sat on one of those cushy sofas, and he said, so tell me what's been going on. And he kind of knew, because anyone who followed our team had sort of seen what had happened to me. I mean, I went from being one of the players that played the most, that was always in there at the end, that was the key player on the team, to, as that season went on, I kind of started to not get to play at all. I think in the championship game I only played about 6 or 8 minutes by the end of the season. So he kind of knew that I had had a difficult season, but he said, so tell me what's been going on. So I proceeded to give him about the 45-minute version of the 5 or 10-minute version that I just gave you guys, about how I can't shoot it anymore, I can't handle a ball anymore, I can't guard anybody anymore, my teammates don't believe in me, my coach doesn't believe in me. I remember telling him, man, I feel like I was a better player as a senior in high school than I am right now as a sophomore in college. And I remember saying how it's just not fun anymore, practice isn't fun anymore, and on and on and on and on and on. And so when I finally took a breath and stopped talking, he said, so, Dina, you've just spent, a good amount of time telling me how you can't shoot anymore, and you can't handle the ball anymore, and you can't guard anybody, and basketball's not fun, your coach doesn't believe in you, you were a better player in high school than you are now. He said, is that what you've been thinking about all season? And I kind of thought about it for a second, and I said, well, yeah, actually, it is what I've been thinking about all season. And he said, well, Dina, you know what you need to do. And so I scooted up to the edge of the sofa because I was ready for the great Dr. Bob to fix me. I was ready for the words of wisdom to fix my confidence problem. So I was listening real closely, and he said, Dina, what you need to do is you need to spend the rest of this spring and this upcoming summer just sitting around thinking about how good you are. I scooted up a little more, and I said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, you just need to sit around and think about how good you are. And I can remember asking a few follow-up questions, like I was wanting drills to do in the gym or just something more tangible that he could give me, like this is the great Dr. Bob. I was hoping for something more, and so I asked a few more questions, but it was pretty clear, no more than 5 or 10 minutes later, that he was done. He didn't really have too much else to tell me. I thought, this guy's an idiot. I wanted to call Tom Kite right then and there and say, look, man, I don't know how much you're paying this guy, but he's an idiot. He's a fraud. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But after a couple of days of sort of marinating in that conversation and sort of revisiting what he told me, that turned out to be some of the best advice that anybody ever gave me. First thing that what he said made me do is it made me think about what I was thinking about. I'd never done that before. It had never occurred to me to think about what I was thinking about. And the second thing it made me do is it made me start to study and compare myself to some really confident and successful athletes and what they were thinking about. And the great thing about being at a place like UVA was I had a lot of those people around me. I mean, I had Dawn Staley on my team, and Dawn's probably one of the greatest women's players that ever played. She played on 3 Olympic teams, and she'll get inducted into the Hall of Fame, and she's one of the most confident and successful athletes, one of the most confident and successful people I've ever been around. And she was my teammate for 3 years. Her locker was right next to mine for 3 years. So we would go play pickup games that spring, and I would start to study Dawn, not necessarily her game, like not her physical skills. I would start to study the way she thought about basketball and the way she thought about herself as a basketball player. Another guy that I spent a lot of time with during that period after my sophomore year was a guy named Rick Carlisle, who's now a head coach in the NBA. And he's the head coach of the Dallas Mavericks now. But at the time, Rick was at the tail end of his pro career. He played 7 or 8 years in the NBA and was on the Celtics team that won a world championship with Bird and McHale and Parrish and those guys. Well, right about my sophomore year, Rick's about 12 years older than me, and he played at Virginia. And right about my sophomore year, Rick was still playing, so he would come back to Charlottesville and train. He'd be in Charlottesville working out all spring and all summer. So that spring and summer, Rick was always in the gym shooting, and I was always in the gym shooting, and he was always in the weight room working out, and I was always in the weight room working out. And so we became friends. And he knew I liked to shoot. He knew I liked to practice a lot, and so he started inviting me to come do these shooting workouts with him. And they were always fun, and they were always competitive, and he almost always beat me. In fact, he says he always beat me. He claims I never beat him, which might be true. But one of the things that I learned, even though I hardly ever beat him, was I had the opportunity to study the way he thought about shooting. And Rick was one of those guys that he's not athletic. He's certainly not a great defensive player, but he could do one thing really, really well, good enough to be on an NBA team for 7 or 8 years, and the one thing he could do well was shoot it. So in all those times we had these competitive shooting games, I started to study, not his form, but I started studying the way he thought about shooting. I started to notice some big differences between the way I thought about the game and the way these really confident and successful athletes thought about the game. The first thing that I started to notice was I could go into a game and I could shoot 9 out of 10. And when I left the gym, what do you think I was thinking about? I was thinking about the one I missed. Like, man, I should have had that one. That was an easy one. I blew that one, man. I missed that one. I should have had that one. A guy like Rick Carlisle or Dawn Staley, they could go into a game and they could shoot 1 out of 10. And when they left the gym, what do you think they were thinking about? I know I missed those 9, but did you see that one? Man, that one was sweet. It was right in that guy's face. They were thinking about the one that felt good. They were thinking about the one that went in. So I learned that we all have what I call selective amnesia. What we tend to remember is different from person to person. I started to realize that what these confident and successful athletes were choosing to remember was very different from what I was choosing to remember. What I realized was that I needed to change the way I was thinking about basketball if I wanted to reach my aspirations, if I wanted to be who I wanted to be. And what I quickly realized is just like you have physical habits, you also have mental habits. The way you think is just a habit. You know, and think about how hard it's been for some of you guys this week to change your physical habits, especially you guys that are accustomed to going off one foot and playing fast and out of control, or leaping to pass is another one. A lot of times you have that habit. It's a really difficult habit to break. You can't break it in 2 or 3 days. You have to continue to practice and replace it with a different habit. Well, the way you think right now is a habit that you've been training yourself to do for some of you 20, 21, 22, 23 years. So I realized I wasn't going to just change those habits overnight. They were deeply ingrained. But the good news is they were just habits. And I knew if it was a habit, I could replace it with a better habit. Just like I could replace going off one foot with stopping under control on 2 feet. And so I can honestly say that once I realized that I needed to start taking responsibility for where I was putting my attention and that no one else was going to do it for me, I can honestly say that for the next 2.5 years, I worked harder and was more disciplined about retraining the way I thought, specifically about myself as a basketball player, than I had ever been on working on any of my physical skills. And I was always a very hard worker. I was always the hardest worker on every team I played on. I practiced a lot. But I can honestly say that I had to work harder on changing the way I thought than I ever had on any of my physical skills. And so a couple of the things that I did when I came home that summer was, once I figured that out, was I came back to my hometown that summer, and at night I would go play pickup games at my high school with a bunch of bunch of local guys that lived in my town. And I'd play for 2 or 3 hours, and when I would come home, I would make myself